I thought I would take a little time and talk about another piece of mine that I understand you actually played here a number of years ago. And it's a piece that's very important in my life. It's my Percussion Concerto. And it was written for Christopher Lamb, who was the principal percussionist of the New York Philharmonic. It was written in 1994 for the New York Philharmonic's 150th anniversary. And what's important to me about this work is that it was written for a really marvelous young percussionist who I really knew before he was the principal in New York. He was a student at the Eastman School of Music, where I taught for 30 years. And he was, at the time, I remember him back in the late 70s, one of the most prominent young percussionists, certainly at the school. And then very soon after graduating, he ends up with the principal position in New York. So it was a fortuitous opportunity. During this 150th anniversary of the New York Philharmonic, they were commissioning a number of works for their principal players. Okay, so there was an oboe concerto written, trombone concerto, and then percussion concerto, and a number of other concertos written for the principal players. And so I was asked to write this piece for Christopher Lamb. I spent a whole day at Avery Fisher Hall in the bowels of the building, looking at a whole variety of percussion instruments. I mean, it's extraordinary how many percussion instruments there are in the world today. And one of the things that excites me about writing for percussion is percussionists in general. Who plays percussion here? One percussionist, okay. One thing that excites me about percussionists is they're very open about music, and they have a very wide, usually a very wide and diverse kind of background. They also have maybe 1,000 mallets they have, and they'd like to tell you all about them and how different they are. And so they have this very broad kind of interest in music. Everything from jazz to blues to rock to kind of world music, as well as classical music and new music. They really are maybe the most, in my way, in my experience over the years, the most enlightened musicians, it seems to me. So I was most excited to engage the idea of percussion. One of the problems with percussion is there are so many instruments. It's not like writing a piccolo concerto where you know what instrument you're going to have. You have just a huge panoply of hundreds of different possible instruments that might be considered useful in a composition like this. Not only that, there really is no instrument in the arsenal of percussion that really has a kind of singing quality to it, like a violin or a cello or a clarinet. And I needed that in one part, in one of the movements of the work. And so that was a bit of a challenge. At the end of the day, I came up with a piece that involves about 23 or 24 percussion instruments that are employed by the soloist. And one of the difficulties with the piece is, because it involves so many large instruments, it takes up a lot of space. And Avery Fisher Hall is a rather shallow hall, and that led to some real difficulties in setting up the staging. And so what I did was, I actually got permission from the New York Philharmonic. We set up the stage, and I was able to take a video camera and video cam the actual setup of the instrumentation. And the way the instrumentation worked out, there's something in there, I'll use this, was that the orchestra, let's say this is the stage of the orchestra, we decided to have the percussionist in the back of the orchestra. And the orchestra was set up on a series of risers, okay? Now some orchestras set up all on the floor, but the New York Phil has a series of risers that can be utilized, and they're about 12 inches. So this is like 36 inches on the top, on this top riser. And this is where the percussionists were set. Actually, there was a double row of risers. So I put the soloist here, and then his colleagues, the other percussionists, were behind him. Now, why did I do that? Well, a principal percussionist has a specific kind of role. You know what that role is in an orchestra? You play in the orchestra here? Yeah. Are you the principal?
I guess.
Okay. Okay. All right, well what happens is that in some pieces of music where there may be a half a dozen different percussion instruments, sometimes composers will just list those instruments and not indicate how many percussionists are required. And so it's the job of the principal to really decide, right? He's kind of the head of the group. It's his job to decide who plays what instruments. So he has a kind of administrative responsibility in the section, right? And the other thing is, he's also the principal. Principals make more money than non-principals. So he has a very kind of elevated status, principals do, in the hierarchy of an orchestra. So on one hand, I wanted him to be, it's a piece for him, so there's lots of time for solo playing. But he's also, number two, just a member of the percussion section. So I wanted to write music that involved him as a soloist in this whole cadre of percussion musicians. And so he needed to be close to them. He needed to be part of the ensemble. Hence, it seemed, because of the way that the stage is set up, it was important to have them together like that. We actually had to move the brass. Brass normally occupy that. Usually the percussionists are over here in the New York Philharmonic. And so we moved them up to this riser. And I'm just pointing all this out because there's a lot of logistical issues that don't take place when you write a clarinet concerto, right? But this became a really big deal before I even started writing any notes or thinking about how I would proceed musically. We had to get this down, and we had to get it down right. So here we move all the percussionists, the brass begin to move over here. The next level where there's also some brass, then the next riser down are the woodwinds, doing this very quickly, and then of course the strings here. I established another area in the orchestra, and here's the conductor, another area in the orchestra where the percussion soloist has a series of instruments as well. And it's a three-movement work. In the second movement, the soloist moves from this position down to a kind of typical concerto position in the front of the orchestra. And in that second movement, then, the rest of the percussionists remain silent. It just focuses on the soloist. And then in the third movement, he moves back again to his initial position. Okay. Now, between the second movement, which is a slow movement essentially, and the third movement, there's no break. It goes directly into the third movement for those of you who have played this piece. And I have to deal with the issue of, well, how do I get him back from here to here when there's no pause? And the music just literally starts. So, obviously he just walks back. But I discussed this with Chris Lamb, and I said, look, what are we going to do? How are we going to get him back? He says, I got an idea. And the idea is that there's an instrument that he actually makes and sells to his fellow percussion colleagues. It's called a shakery. And what it is a large gourd. We don't have one here, do we? Probably not.
We might have. I'll look.
Okay. It's a really groovy instrument. It's a large gourd with an opening here, and then there's a series of beads on a kind of web all around it. And so when you shake the gourd, it makes a really hell of a racket. I mean, it's a really loud instrument. But the great thing is that if you hold it here and then tap on the instrument on the bottom, it has this kind of wonderful thud to it. Well, there's an example of it. Yeah, go for it. It's not subtle, is it? No. Yeah, let's hear the other one. The other one looks pretty cool. Yeah. Okay, can you hit it on the bottom? Oh, you hear the thud? Well, it's thunk. It's a kind of thunk sound, yeah. So do a little shaking and thunking. All right, pretty cool. Pretty cool, okay. Yeah, that's it. So what we worked out was, okay, you pick up your shakery down here, and just go ahead and improvise on that as you walk back.